This is Chapter 56, Population Ecology. Ecology is the study of how organisms relate to each other within a population and to their environment. The environment is the controlling factor. It determines what you'll find and where you'll find it in any particular area. Organisms respond to the abiotic environment, meaning how they behave and how they appear is response to where they live. The abiotic world is temperature, water quality, how much it rains, sunlight, any of the non-living things that you would find in the real world. Within a particular population, you will find a climate, and that climate will control how and where this population lives, how and well the individuals survive. Each individual will have a range that fits them. The temperature range, the water range. In other words, how much can they survive in? How hot or how cold, for example. If they are living in a temperature range that is right dead in the middle, that's where they're going to survive the best. If they're living on the extremes, where it's really hot or really cold for them, they will have a more difficult time surviving. Temperature not only is how hot or how cold it is in a day or in a season, but how different they are overall. How hot is it during the day compared to how cold it is at night? Water availability. How often does it rain and how much does it rain? If you live in an area where it's dry, do you have a way to find water? And if you have found it, do you have a way to store it? If you live where it's wet, do you have a way to stay dry? Do you know how to keep your burrow from flooding or your nest from washing away? Sunlight and soil are more related to plants. The plants are extremely important though because they determine the animals that live there. You have to have a certain amount and a certain type of plants to support the herbivores and the carnivores. So how much sunlight, how many hours, how strong it is, the quality of the soil, how many nutrients, how much water, those determine the plants, and then the plants determine the animals. These are pictures of 4 different type of climates, each with their own controlling factors, and we will talk about those when we discuss this chapter in class. Animals respond to their environment in particular ways. The short term and the long term. Short term is what do you do right now to be comfortable? Do you shiver when you're cold? Do you seek shelter when you're cold? Do you sweat when you're hot? Those are short-term responses. Plants respond in the same way. If it's hot, they close their stomata, meaning they close the cells that allow water to escape. They wilt if it's really, really hot. Long-term responses are physiological, which are the internal things, the different ways your body responds on the inside. This is genetic. For example, elk that live at very high altitudes have more red blood cells than elk that live in the valleys. This is because high altitudes have less oxygen atoms in the atmosphere. Since red blood cells move oxygen throughout the body, having more of them helps to move the air or the oxygen within the body better. Another example are deep sea fishes. The deep sea fishes live in temperatures that are very close to freezing. They have a chemical in their body that is very similar to antifreeze. That antifreeze keeps the blood flowing and keeps the water in the cells from freezing. Another response is morphological. Morphology is structure. For example, do you have fur? Is it thick fur or is it thin, which would be more like hair? The bird bone is another morphological response. Most bones are solid, but because birds spend the majority of their time in the air, they have to be light, and so their bones are hollow. Behavior is also considered morphological, even though it's not really a structure. So organisms that migrate when the rains come, that hibernate when it's cold, those are behavioral responses to the environment. A population also has a range. This is where you find them in their habitat. Populations aren't static, meaning they move. Populations move into and out of their range, as well as individuals moving into and out of their range. You would move on purpose because you're looking for food, you're looking for better resources. Or you move by accident. This is more of an individual response because you were chased out by a predator or you were chased out by bad weather and you can't find your way home. My picture, the environmental change on the left would be, in a sense, accidental because it's not something that the population did. This was an environmental change. The organisms that lived in the grasslands were confined to the first half a kilometer along this mountain slope. As the environment changed, it got hotter and drier, the grasslands expanded up to 2 kilometers. That meant the range of the animals that lived within the grasslands was able to expand up to 2 kilometers. Those organisms that lived within the woodlands not only had their range get smaller, but it also moved farther up the mountains. So their range moved in position and it also got smaller. The picture on the right is a cattle egret. In the 1930s, they were found in South America, but over time, the populations began to move, looking for better habitat, looking for more resources, so that by the time the 1970s were around, they were in North America and in parts of Canada. Within a population's range, species have different spacing patterns. This is their response to their environment. The first is random. These are organisms that are considered solo. They don't interact with other individuals of their own species except possibly during mating season. They are also not tied to their environment, meaning if their water hole dries up, they can go somewhere else. Uniform spacing is the result of resource competition. Resources are limited, and so the individuals that have them defend them. They do that by creating territories. Since each organism has a territory that they guard, then they're spaced apart depending on the size of each territory. Clumped spacing is usually a response to resources that are found sporadically in the environment. For example, African animals are clumped around water holes. You also find clump spacing in the social animals, birds that flock together, fish that school together. This is usually in response to predators. Larger groups are protection from predators. Populations change over time in terms of size and the number of individuals of any given age. They call that survivorship. There are 3 types of survivorship curves that show the specific number of animals that you might find at any particular age group. My picture shows all 3 survivorship types. The first one is a type 1. This is a human or moose or any of the large animals. These individuals care for their young, and they usually have their babies at an older age, so they're a little more experienced. That means that the young survive better, and so you have more young surviving to middle age. Once they get past middle age, though, they begin to die rapidly, as you see as the curve drops off. The middle group is the type 2. They have the hydra as the example. The hydra is a marine organism, but you could replace that with squirrels. This group, they have babies at a younger age, so they're not as experienced. And these organisms, you're just as likely to die young, middle-aged, or old. So that's why the line is so straight. The type 3, oysters, insects, fish, they have lots of babies at an early age. Most of those babies die because they don't really care for them. If you are a baby that manages to survive all the way to middle age, you have a pretty good chance of dying of old age. Life history involves a couple of different factors. What you're looking at here is you want, as an individual or a species, to have the largest number of babies survive as possible so that they can create a new generation. There are two factors that actually will control how well this survivorship happens. The first is the age of the parent. If you're an older parent, then you have more experience, and so you're better able to provide. You also are more likely to protect them and provide for them individually. The other factor is how many young you have at any one time. If you only have 1 or 2 babies, then the amount of resources that you have to give them is smaller. Because remember, if you're, say, an animal hunting and you bring home a kill, normally you would eat it all. But if you have a baby, you have to give them some. If you have 2 babies, you have to give them more. So the more babies you have, the more food you have to give them and the less you have for yourself. The same is energy in terms of protection. Normally you would spend all your energy protecting yourself. If you have 1 baby, then you spend a certain amount protecting them. If you have 4 or 5 or 6, you spend more energy guarding your babies than you do sleeping or looking for food. So there's a trade-off between reproduction and survivorship. How many babies can you have, can you care for, and you can bring to adulthood before it starts to affect you and maybe make you die earlier than you normally would. Environmental limits to population growth. What this means is that if there were no limits on a population, all the food, all the shelter, all the mates, everything was perfect, an organism would reproduce at what's called their biotic potential, how much their bodies could do. This would be exponential growth and the population would explode. However, there is no environment that does not have some kind of limitation. That means that all populations will reach that limit. If they reach that limit and then go past, the population will crash and massive numbers of individuals will starve. In this picture, you have a population growth curve. The red line is a population showing their biotic potential. They grow as fast as they can and basically shoot off the chart. In this example, the limit of individuals that the population can carry, the carrying capacity, is 1,000, meaning that over 1,000 individuals, this environment will not be able to provide the resources that they need. The blue line shows a population that grows quickly, and then as the numbers begin to grow, that growth rate decreases until it reaches carrying capacity and then it levels off. This line isn't really exactly true. In the real world, what would happen is the population would grow slightly above 1,000, and then somebody would die because of hunger or extra predation, and the number would drop lower. And it would oscillate, going a little bit above and a little bit below, but the average is that straight line. This is the formula for population growth. You don't have to memorize the formula. If they want you to use this formula on the exam, they will give it to you. But you do need to understand the variables. The little dn over little dt is rate of growth, meaning how many individuals are present at any given time. The rate of increase, how fast does this population grow? Is it a fast number or a slow number? Number of individuals that are present, and then of course carrying capacity. So if you have a fast rate of increase and a large number of individuals, growth rate will go very, very quickly. The number will be high. If your rate of increase is high, but you don't have many individuals, the growth rate will be substantially slower. That's what this formula is all about. This graph shows growth rate. It's a little bit upside down. This blue line is carrying capacity. When you're above carrying capacity, this is actually negative growth rate. So actually this is kind of an upside down thing. As you get closer and closer and closer to carrying capacity, growth rate stays negative. You're not growing, you're decreasing. If you are below carrying capacity, then your population number is actually increasing, and so you actually have positive growth rate up until that point. There are two types of populations. There are the R-selected and the K-selected. R-selected species generally populate their range closer to their biotic potential. K is more related to carrying capacity. R-selected species have a short lifespan. They have a high mortality rate for all ages, particularly the young. So these are usually a type 2 or a type 3 group. This group has a short time span between being young and being an adult. They reproduce early in life, they reproduce often, and they produce a lot of babies at any one time. They don't care for their young very much, or they don't care for their young at all. The R-selected species are the rodents, fish, insects, bacteria. The K-selected species are opposite of the R's. They have a long lifespan. They have a low mortality rate for pretty much all of their individuals, which makes them a type 1. They have a long time between birth and adulthood. They reproduce later in life. They don't reproduce as often, maybe once every year or once every 2 years. They usually only reproduce with 1 or 2 babies as a result, and they care for those babies extensively. These are the large mammals: humans, bears, moose, those type of animals. Factors that regulate population, of course, include resources. If you have a limited number of resources, the cost of reproduction is high, meaning that you have to reduce what you take in to care for your babies. This is where the K-selected species do well. They're good at competition because they compete with each other, and so they are fine with limited resource. When resources are abundant, where there's lots of food and lots of water for everybody, then the cost of reproduction is low. This is where the R-selected species do well. They don't compete for food, and so they don't regulate themselves. So there's lots of food, they eat it till it's gone. Depending on the resource availability, you can be an R, or you can be a K, or you can be somewhere in between, meaning that an R-selected species that breeds a lot with limited resources will not reproduce as often, making them act more like a K. A K species that generally doesn't reproduce a lot, if there are a lot of resources, will make more babies than normal. So there's a spectrum between R and K. Humans are a K-selected species that are currently acting like an R. What this means is that we have a limited carrying capacity, limited amount of food, and we operate well there. The problem is we are artificially changing that carrying capacity. We fertilize soil that isn't very good. We water when there isn't enough rain. So we provide food for more individuals than the environment can actually support. We have medicines to get rid of disease, and we extend the lifespan. Which this means is that we have more individuals to reproduce to make more babies, which means we are actually acting more like our biotic potential than a K-selected species. Some organizations have suggested that by 2050, we will have exceeded our carrying capacity, and that if we do not do something technologically, our population will crash. There are ways to negatively regulate populations. In other words, bring population numbers down. Density dependent are things that come into play when a population gets overcrowded. This is also called negative feedback. For example, when you have an extra large population, you have an increase in intra-specific competition, meaning competition between individuals for resources. Those individuals who cannot compete die. When populations get large, predation increases, meaning predators notice your population when they didn't notice you before, which again means those individuals who are weaker, younger, or on the outside get eaten, and those numbers are increased because you have a larger population, so therefore numbers decrease overall. You have the result of just overcrowding. If you crowd a population, general health goes down, and so individuals get sick when the environment changes when they wouldn't normally, bringing the numbers down. Again, you also have more aggression. More aggression means more fighting. Fighting means there's accidents. Individuals die. And then, of course, you have disease. If you crowd a bunch of individuals into a small place and you introduce disease, then you have more people or more individuals die faster. There is an opposite called the Ali effect. That means that growth actually increases when a population gets to a certain size, meaning they don't breed if the population is small. On the left, that would be the locusts. Locusts breed only when their population gets crowded. Once they get crowded, they breed, and then they migrate to new areas. On the right was an interesting study of puffins. In the 1980s, there was a colony of puffins that was very small. Biologists were studying them because although there were plenty of resources, they were not breeding. They finally decided that it was possibly because the population size had gotten too small. So what they did was they made a whole bunch of wooden puppets. They basically made puffin cutouts, stuck a cassette tape to the back that made puffin sounds, and they populated the island with these little wooden puffins. The real puffins were actually fooled by the wooden ones, thought the population size had increased, and bred. They left them there for a few breeding seasons, and eventually there were enough live puffins that they could take the wood ones away. The Ali effect. The last thing I'm going to talk about are population pyramids. These are bar graphs that show individuals the number of individuals at a particular age category. This was originally done to study human populations, but they can move them to animals, plants. It all works the same way. It's used to determine whether or not a population is stable and what the size is going to be in the future. On the left-hand side is a growing population. If you look at the bottom, this is humans, so everything from, 0 down to approximately 40 is what they consider the breeding age. This number is large. As they get older and breed, there's a large number of young individuals who will create more babies. This means the population is growing. In the middle is the declining population. If you compare the 40, 30 age range to this younger 2010, there are much smaller numbers of individuals who will become the reproducing group. That means that there will be fewer babies and this population will decline. On the right side, you have a stable population. If you compare 40, 30, 20, the population is all approximately the same size, meaning that the same number of individuals will be born with each generation, so the population overall will remain stable. This is the end of chapter 56, Population Ecology.